Welcome to a crappy Monday here on Locked On Grizzlies, not because it's just Joe Mullinax as your host. I'm here with Damichael Cole, which is fantastic. We love Damichael, obviously. We are your co-hosts, but not all is well in Memphis right now. Steven Adams out for the entire season, not just the regular season, the season period. What does this mean for the team? Will they hold it close to the vest? Will they go out and bring outside help? All that and more. Let's lock in.
You are Locked On Grizzlies, your daily Memphis Grizzlies podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Welcome to a Monday edition of Locked On Grizzlies, and forgive us if we have a case of the Mondays. Things not going particularly well for the Grizzlies at this moment in time. A very important player who, if you followed this team for any reasonable amount of time, you know how important Steven Adams is. He is out. Memphis is back at square one with the center position, and there's lots of different ways this can go over the next 72 hours, much less the next several months here for the Memphis Grizzlies. Welcome to Locked On Grizzlies. I am Joe Mullinax of Bluff City Media, joined by Damichael Cole of the Commercial Appeal in Memphis, Tennessee. This episode of Locked On Grizzlies is brought to you by Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use the code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off your first purchase. We are free and available wherever you get your podcasts as proud members of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team each and every day. Check us out on YouTube and wherever you get your podcasts. Of course, like, comment, rate, review, subscribe. Please make us an everyday part of your NBA and Memphis Grizzlies content consumption. Damichael, you had a very busy Sunday, right? And that's not necessarily out of the norm as the NBA season approaches. And I am curious because you obviously being the beat writer for the Grizzlies, for the Commercial Appeal, you have a little bit more information than most. And I understand you may not be able to go full tilt here. The bomb that was dropped by the Grizzlies themselves, like this wasn't a Woj bomb or a Shams bomb or a sham strike, however you want to call it. Right. It was the team announced it that Steven Adams is going to miss the entire season due to surgery on the PCL in his knee. That surprised pretty much everyone, but I'm guessing to get to this point, it didn't necessarily surprise the Grizzlies themselves.
It didn't surprise them as much as the rest of us, but there was some initial, a shock there on that end as well. But if we would have recorded Saturday, usually we don't record on the weekends, but we had the game on Friday, and if we were recapping that game on Saturday, I think that we would have let that show off with Steven Adams as well, from the perspective of should Grizzlies fans be concerned, because he had all that time off. And he only played 27 minutes in the preseason, and he sat out the last preseason game, and that was kind of a red flag in itself right there. But you kind of, hindsight is always 20/20 in these situations. I always have to say that but at the same time, if you look back and you remember what we were talking about on here in Steven Adams's words. Steven Adams everyone kept saying, hey, are you going to be ready to start in the regular season? Or are you going to be ready to play this many games or that many games? And Steven Adams kept saying, hey, I'm taking it day by day. And usually, Joe, that's cliche talk, right? You hear that coaches say it all the time, players, hey, day by day. But Steven Adams literally meant this thing is day by day. There were still ongoing flare-ups in the knee and things like that. And it was literally a day-by-day basis. We talked about how he fully participated in scrimmages. There was the whole ramp-up period and things like that. But his knee, at the end of the day, it wasn't, responding to the level that he wanted, to the level that the Grizzlies wanted, where they felt comfortable going into this regular season, still having similar flare-ups from last year. And, it just got to the point where he had to get this surgery. And I want people to understand this too. We're going to get into it a little bit deeper, but with this surgery, this isn't this is a 4 to 6 month thing, not even really projected to be 6 to 8 months. Joe, this is projected to be 10 to 12 months.
This is a significant injury.
This is a
significant surgery.
And he's a big man. We talk about big man, knee injuries, and everything in between. I kind of know, based on what you've said about Brandon Clark, where you may be leaning a little bit later on, but I'm going to let you say it for yourself, because if people been following Locked On Grizzlies, they probably can figure that out. But without going much into what you may be saying there, I just think that people have to remember, a lot of people say, oh, well, why couldn't he gotten this in May and whatnot? Well, I think, quite frankly, if you look back in May and you say, hey, look, Steven Adams, you can get the surgery now, and guess what? You're still going to miss all of next season, or we can let this thing rehab all throughout the summer, and we can see, if it responds well enough to the point where we can have you for 60 games in the regular season and a potential playoff run next year. And I think Steven Adams, in that case scenario, would have said, yeah, let's do it. That's definitely not what happened. I'm just kind of talking it from a retrospective point of view here, basically saying this: Steven Adams getting surgery in May, Steven Adams getting surgery in now, not really a big difference on the long-term realm of things for the Grizzlies. And then if you go back before that, Joe, a lot of people say, oh, well, he could have got this done in March. Well, guess what? In March, there was still a possibility. We talked about it here on Locked On Grizzlies for sure. There was still a possibility that he could be back for the postseason. Right. So you couldn't close that door on him at that point without knowing that there was still the possibility that he could be back for the playoffs.
Everything you just said is exactly why I am not as mad about this as I was Sunday morning or afternoon when it dropped. Because you're exactly right. The nature of the injury, right? Like when you hear about knees, and obviously you have a background in sports. I'm a coach in my day job. You hear ACL, MCL, LCL, meniscus. Those are the things that you usually associate with the knee.
Yeah.
The PCL is a very different part of your knee construction that involves a lot more bones. It involves a lot more movement in terms of the stability, and that's one of the things that the Grizzlies talked about in their release. The lack of stability in that region. Yeah, that could lead to larger issues down the road than just the PCL. And again, that is a significant injury, but if you have that instability, not only would you have a PCL, he could blow out his entire knee, and because of the weakening in that space, it could be even worse than maybe it would have normally been if that PCL was strong. So there's so much that, like I said, I was frustrated about it from that May perspective, because I agree with you with the March thing. Like you heard Taylor Jenkins talking about, he can come back, right? We think he'll be back for the postseason. It
was a possibility.
I was mad about May. And then after a little more research, because again, even with my background, I am not as familiar with the PCL. And after doing 20 minutes of research, like it wouldn't have made a difference if they had had the surgery in May. The timeline's basically the same, right? Like he would probably not have been back until training camp 2024, having the surgery in May. So doing it now makes sense. And it's frustrating. It makes me more so frustrated with the front office than the medical staff. Like if you knew this was possible all along, and we're going to talk about, towards the end of the show, if they were to go outside of the organization. But you and I know, Damichael, and we just approach it differently. They're not going to do a damn thing. Like nothing's going, they're not going to make a move. When you have your prognostications, you try to do it through the lens of Jenkins and Zach Kleiman, as well you should. I think that's a fine perspective. I talk about things like the way I would do them, right? Just because I'm crazy. I am frustrated with the front office who knew this was a possibility. You've seen what this team looks like without Steven Adams. You know what they are. It's not like this is an uncertainty, right? And now you're right back where you were. And yet you have nothing that you've done to try to address the problem. There is not a true big on the roster. He doesn't exist. Like Jared Jackson Jr. is not a true big. And they have to address that, even though they're not going to address it. And it throws the entire season in jeopardy at this point.
Yeah, and let's save some meat on the bone for the end, because I want to say this, Joe. I'm not going to close the door on them making a move. I'm not going to shut the door completely on them making an outside move and adding a player to the roster. We're going to get to that later. I want to say that I strictly right now, it's more about just what Steven Adams brings to the table for this team and what they're really going to miss. But just to go on that point, I do think they'll potentially do something. And, one thing that's kind of was stuck in the back of my head is, yes, they didn't do nothing, that was big in the offseason, but they did create flexibility that we talked about with, that traded player exception. So that, we talked about how
that's fair.
That could come into play at some point, and now it's even more relevant than before. But Steven Adams is a big part of this team. I've seen people say, when we talked about the idea of what the Grizzlies need to do now, Xavier Tillman Sr., Kenneth Lofton Jr., outside, enhancements, whatever the case may be, you're not going to solely replace what he brings to the table. But the Grizzlies, because of the depth that we talked about, because of the depth we're going to continue to talk about on this show, they put themselves in a position to take a blow like this and kind of put themselves in position to still be relevant.
I think you're right. Again, they could go small, they could go big, they could do a lot of different things in terms of actually addressing the problem. But will they actually happily be talked out of it? Because I think they need to do something, and it sounds like maybe you'll take that shot. But as you alluded to, we'll talk more about that as the show goes on. Shout out to Steven Adams' screening, his rebounding, his above-average defense, his passing, which is underappreciated.
Yeah.
Steven Adams is one of the most important players on this team, and him not being there is massively important, and it is a big deal for this team to not have Adams in the fold. We'll talk about the possibilities for the Grizzlies coming out of losing such an influential player for the season in Steven Adams next here on Locked On Grizzlies. But first, this episode of Locked On Grizzlies is brought to you by Gametime. Gametime is a wonderful application where you can go and find yourself all sorts of different types of tickets. You shouldn't feel rushed. You shouldn't feel like you don't have an opportunity to go to the events that you want to go to. You shouldn't have to think, am I going to see the game or the event the way that I want to see it? Gametime takes care of all of that for you. You can go and check out all the different events coming to your area. Last-minute tickets are available as well as flash deals. You get views from every single seat in the venue. Plus, they have the lowest price guarantee, which means you always get the best price. If you find tickets in the same section and row for less, Gametime will credit you 110%. That is a significant chunk of change. Take the guesswork out of buying tickets with Gametime. Download the Gametime app, create an account, and use the code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off your first purchase. Terms apply. Again, create an account and redeem the code LOCKEDONNBA for $20 off. Download Gametime today. Last minute tickets, lowest price guaranteed. When we come back here on Locked On Grizzlies, what if Memphis decides to do absolutely nothing, which in my opinion is the most likely outcome? Maybe Damichael disagrees with me. We'll explore that further next here on Locked On Grizzlies. Welcome back to Locked On Grizzlies. It is I, Joe Mullinax of Bluff City Media. I'm the Memphis Grizzlies columnist for that website, joined by my co-host here on Locked On Grizzlies, Damichael Cole of the Commercial Appeal in Memphis, Tennessee. He is the beat writer for that publication. I've been covering the Grizzlies since 2013. Damichael, of course, with his access as a beat writer there at the Commercial Appeal. Third year, I believe, Damichael. Tell me if I'm wrong on that. Third year.
Oh, you're right.
You're
Memphis. Right. Third season. Yes. Second full season.
Well, you're from Memphis, but third season, covering as a beat writer. Between the two of us is my point. You've come to the right place with Grizzlies content. Hopefully you'll make us your first stop each and every day here on Locked On Grizzlies. Steven Adams is out. We talked about that in the first segment. We talked about the screening, the rebounding, the passing, the above average defense, just the fact that he's elite at being big, right? I've talked about that all the time. And that's not meant as a slight on him. Like, that is a very valuable skill. And it helped the Grizzlies immensely. You could argue outside of Morant, Bane, and Jaren Jackson Jr., Adams is the most important Memphis Grizzly. Now, Marcus Smart hasn't played yet. Maybe that adjusts. But, Steven Adams was number 4, at least in terms of levels of importance. He's gone now. What do you do? I feel that the most likely scenario, and again, I can't wait for the last segment because that's where my brain gets flowing, as you know, partner. But the most likely scenario is that they do nothing, right? That they sit, they have this depth. That doesn't mean that they couldn't do something later. That's important, right? I think Bobby Marks of ESPN outlined that once November 2nd hits here in a couple of weeks, they can add Ja Morant to the suspended list. They can add a player that way. They can apply for a disabled player exception. Or that I might be saying that wrong.
But disabled player exception. Yeah, I wrote about that too.
Yeah, so they could do that and open up a roster spot, save some money. They have the traded player exception, which you talked about in the previous segment. So there's a lot of things that they can do, right?
Right.
But this team very much believes in the roster that they've built. And in fairness to them, they've had a lot of success with the roster that they've built. They believe in Xavier Tillman Sr. They believe in Kenneth Lofton Jr. They believe in what they've got. This could open up opportunity for David Roddy at the 4. If you're going to play Santi Aldama even as a center at times, it means Jaren Jackson Jr. is going to have to play more center, which if you watch FIBA, that's not necessarily the best thing for the Grizzlies. I am concerned, Damichael, that this is the route they're going to take because we've seen this show before, right? We watched it all since, essentially March of last season. And even before that, right? I think even into January and February, Steven Adams was struggling with this. So we've seen this before. We know how it ends. This is a team that has the potential to be a contender in the Western Conference, even with Ja Morant's suspension. I think the do-nothing option would be a mistake, but I also think it's the most likely thing for them to do because of the depth that they have and because they believe so much in the people that they've brought into the organization.
Yeah, and if they do nothing, Joe, I think that's basically, in a way, it's saying, hey, we're fine with just making the playoffs this year. And I
agree completely. I want to stress, you're exactly right.
And I don't think that's the mentality around here.
I hope you're right.
That's kind of, you bring in Derrick Rose ain't coming here. What he said, he ain't coming here to babysit. You know what else he ain't coming here to do? To win 40 games and be, a 7th or 8th seed and potentially miss the playoffs because of a play-in. Like, he ain't coming here to do that. Marcus Smart is pretty much second round Eastern Conference Finals his entire career. He ain't coming here to be, a 42-win team and to sneak into playoffs as an 8th seed and be a first-round exit. Like, those guys, they weren't brought in for that. They're brought in to be potential needle-moving pieces that can get the Grizzlies to the next level, out of that first round to the second round, potentially Western Conference Finals, championship contention, all of that good stuff. Xavier Tillman Sr., this is the good, with that situation. The good is you saw 29 starts last season. Not just 29 starts, but a lot of that was, with Santi Aldama and Jaren Jackson Jr. operating as the other primary 2 bigs. A decent amount of that was with Brandon Clark still healthy. But from March on, mid-March, that is, that was pretty much, those 3 guys were your main 3 bigs. Now we know this will probably create opportunity for Kenneth Lofton Jr. a little bit. We kind of talked about, can he take advantage of the opportunity? Well, guess what? We're going to find out now. He will at least be slated in there somewhere. But at the end of the day, we know what you're going to get with Xavier Tillman. And here's the positive on that. The Grizzlies, 29 games last year with Xavier Tillman starting at center. They went 18-11, Joe. You maintain that pace, you're one of the top teams in the Western Conference, at least record-wise in the regular season. Sure. Now here's the downside. The downside is the playoffs, because that's what we're talking about, right, Joe? Like, the regular season success, I've said it all summer. It's ho-hum. Like, it doesn't mean anything around here anymore. You can go win the Southwest Division and win 53 games this season. No one's going to care if you get eliminated in the first round again. Like, it's not going to matter. So I do think they're positioned well to continue the regular season success, but we know that weaknesses, small weaknesses in the regular season turn into big weaknesses in the playoffs. And a big potential weakness for this team could be rebounding. I think Kenneth Lofton Jr. will see what his role looks like, but he has shown me at every stretch up to this point that he can be a great rebounder, but he has other deficiencies in his game where a team may say, we're going to play him off the court to take away his rebounding, ability. Xavier Tillman Sr., his defensive versatility is up there with the best on the Grizzlies. He is great there. Another thing I like about Xavier Tillman's game, go look at the top screen assist guys from the first round of the playoffs last year. That is something I've said in the locker room with him and talked about this, how, he tries to pick up these little things from Steven Adams Jr. From Steven Adams, not Steven Adams Jr. From Steven Adams. And one of those little things that X tries to pick up is the screen assist part of the game. And we saw that, as the season went on and he got better at it. And in the playoffs, he was really good in that area. It was kind of an underrated part, of that first round playoff series. He was really good in that area. So you get the screen assist. Xavier Tillman is a solid playmaker. We know Kenneth Lofton Jr. can score the basketball. The one thing that you really need is a big-time rebounder. And Jaren hasn't proven to be that yet. Santi hasn't proven to be that yet. X hasn't proven, X is solid. He's going to rebound well against certain matchups, but when he goes against Anthony Davis, we saw how that played out. And Kenneth Lofton Jr., from what we've seen, he can rebound, but he has deficiencies in other areas where teams may say, hey, we're going to play him off the floor from this standpoint. So I think the Grizzlies, at the end of the day, they want to move the needle. They don't want to settle here. And if they want to move the needle, something else got to be done. But you can survive. My point is you can survive the regular season with X and Lofton. But if you want bigger and better, you got to do something else.
Let's say the Grizzlies are the 2 seed again, right? Just for hypothetical reasons. Let's give Denver the benefit of the doubt, unlike TNT, right? TNT doesn't even include Jokic in their graphic.
They say he's a horse rider. He's riding horses. There's nothing marketable about it. That's what the people are saying, man.
So anyway, let's give the Nuggets more of the benefit of the doubt than TNT does and say they're the 1 seed. Let's say Memphis is the 2 seed again, right?
Yep.
That means you've got the Warriors, you've got the Lakers, you've got the Clippers, you've got the Suns, you've got the Timberwolves, you've got the Kings. What's the point I'm trying to make? This year, more than any year, I would argue, assuming health, the play-in, and it happened last year to us, right? In terms of the Grizzlies losing to the 7-seeded Lakers.
Yeah.
There's no upset except maybe Denver as the reigning champion. From 2 to 10, at least 2 to 8, it's a gauntlet in terms of teams that are pretty comparable. Only a few games are going to separate them throughout the entire season. So you're right. Could the Grizzlies be the 4 or 5 seed with Xavier Tillman as their starting center? Yeah, I think that's possible. Are they going to lose in the first round? Yeah, I would almost certainly pick anybody to beat the Memphis Grizzlies in a first-round playoff series if Xavier Tillman is their starting center. That's just the reality. And it's not a knock on X. I think X is a really good NBA reserve big.
For sure.
That's what he needs to be. He can't be a starter in a playoff series if you want to go on a championship, even just to get to the Western Conference Finals. If that's the goal, to be in the NBA's Final Four, and if you lose to the Nuggets or the Suns or the Warriors or the Lakers, there's not really shame in that because they're positioned differently than Memphis right now. But I think the goal is the Western Conference Finals. And if that's the goal, you're not getting there as you're currently constructed. So with that in mind, Damichael and I coming up next year on Locked On Grizzlies are going to look at some outside options. What can Memphis do? Should they go big? Should they go small? What could they potentially bring to the table to change things? So it sounds like Damichael and I are on the same page. Regular season-wise, Memphis is probably fine. It's not like they're going to fall out of the playoffs. Memphis, in terms of the playoffs, they should be concerned, and there has to be some sort of change. What that change looks like, we'll talk about next here on Locked On Grizzlies. But first, I want to give a shout-out to the Locked On Ultimate NBA Season Preview. It is here. It is a 6-episode series with all 30 of our Locked On NBA team shows. I've represented us here on Locked On Grizzlies on our show. I believe our title of our tier was What Are We? Or something like that. Yeah. And I was offended by that. If you listen to the show, you'll hear that. But now it's even more fair with the Adams injury. From contenders to tankers, we go in depth into the biggest storylines heading into the season. Catch all 6 episodes of Locked On NBA on YouTube or wherever you get your podcasts. This episode of Locked On Grizzlies is also brought to you by FanDuel. It is obviously NFL football season time, and FanDuel is America's #1 sportsbook, not just for the NFL, but overall. Right now, new customers can get $200 in bonus bets guaranteed when you place a $5 bet. That's $200 in bonus bets, win or lose. You've been thinking about joining FanDuel. There's no better time to get in on the action. The app is so easy to use, and there's a wide range of betting options available, including spreads, player props, over-unders, and so much more. Go visit FanDuel/LockedOn right now. And as the NBA season kicks off here over the next couple of days, obviously you can lock into the NFL season as well. FanDuel, an official partner of the NFL. Coming up next on Locked On Grizzlies, options outside of the organization. Next, stick with us. Welcome back to Locked On Grizzlies. I am Joe Mullinax, joined by my co-host, Damichael Cole. He, of course, of the Commercial Appeal there in Memphis, Tennessee. I am the Memphis Grizzlies columnist for Buff City Media. Damichael is the beat writer covering the Grizzlies for the CA. You come to the right place in terms of Grizzlies content and coverage. Hopefully you'll stick with us throughout the season to come. This is where I shine, right? For anybody that's followed my career, I've been doing this for 10 years now.
It's Joe Mullinax time.
This is armchair GM time, and nobody, I can confidently say this to Michael.
Yeah.
I have longevity. Me and Anthony Sane, we're kind of the last of the dying breed here. To use a wrestling reference, he's probably the Undertaker. I'm probably Triple H in terms of the last outlaws of the grit and grind era when it comes to media. Untraditional media is probably the fairest way to put it. But I love trades, and nobody is good at pissing people off when it comes to this like me. Somehow the Magic fans found out that I want Wendell Carter Jr. And they were very upset with me.
That happened
in my mentions.
I gotta go look.
I gotta go look. I ignored it. I ignored it, which is growth for me, as you know, partner. That's growth. I just, put it aside and said, I'm not going to deal with this, because it's hilarious to me that the Orlando Magic, who are going to be like the 9 seed in the Eastern Conference, are like, no.
Let them have hope. Let them have hope, Joe.
So
it's the preseason. Everyone's filled with hope right now.
Well, I agree that the Grizzlies would have to overpay for Wendell Carter Jr., and they don't really overpay for anything, so they're probably not going to acquire him.
Yeah.
To me, there are varying levels to how they can pursue this. They could go swing big and get a Wendell Carter Jr. and kind of address this and just be done with it, right? I think Time Lord, Robert Williams III there in Portland, who's probably much more realistic than the Magic trade. I think that, that would be another option in terms of addressing this and being done with it. And one of the reasons Portland would be more realistic, at least in my opinion, is they're trying to be bad. So if you want to tag Brandon Clark or Steven Adams and a first-round pick and give it to Portland, I think they say yes. I don't think they say no, because they are trying to be bad. So that makes them worse in this season. Brandon Clark would probably be more attractive to them than Adams. Adams is not quite in the same category as Clark for me, because Adams' game is not as based on athleticism. You alluded to that earlier in the show.
Yeah, there it is.
I put them in the same area. To be honest with you, no. Like, I would still put Clark in there before Adams, because I'm just so terrified that his explosivity is not going to return. Adams can come back and still be elite at being big in 12 months, right? Like, I think he could still do that.
Yeah.
So I would start with Clark. If they wanted Adams, I'd go Adams instead of Clark, but I would start with Clark. So anyway, I think Clark in a first rounder, why would they say no? I'm not sure they would. Clint Capella, obviously, I always mispronounce his name, and maybe you can do better than me, partner. I know they have a center behind Capella that they
Kongu,
Thank you. I appreciate that. They, I've watched him play. They probably want to play him more. Maybe moving on from Capella would make a lot of sense. And in terms of screening, rim running, rebounding, he checks a lot of those boxes. Right. So I think Capella makes a lot of sense. Isaiah Hartenstein up in New York would make a lot of sense. There's rumors there was interest there. Maybe you would know that a little bit more than me. There was interest there when Hartenstein was a free agent. That's the rumor. Again, you would have more insight on that. He doesn't play as much in New York. Mitchell Robinson would be awesome, but again, I think he's more untradeable than Wendell Carter Jr. The point I'm trying to make is there's options, right? I think there's possibility, and there's differing levels of it, right? If they want to go all in and overpay, I want to stress that. While I disagree with anybody being untouchable that I just named, I think you'd have to, is 3 first-round picks too much for Wendell Carter Jr.? Probably, right? That's probably what it would take to get him from Orlando. Is, a Hartenstein, Daniel Gafford. I think he's in Washington right now. Yeah. There's names out there that make sense to add depth to that front court. Where would you land? Because it sounds like we're on the same page. Again, I don't think they're going to do anything. I hope I'm wrong. I want them to do something. What does that something look like to you?
Here's where I am on this, Joe. For one, I want to preach to the fan base the idea of patience.
Which I am not good at. That is not my strength.
I do not expect some big swing right now by any stretch of the imagination. That's why a lot of people say, oh, well, why didn't you let him get this fixed in May because you have a full off season to evaluate things.
And like you said, and I agree with you,
Mm-hmm.
in terms of the next couple of months, are they going to still probably be 14-11? Probably, right?
Mm-hmm. And getting to that point, the first 25 games, it kind of lead me into what I was going to say next. Remember, we've kind of touched on this from the point guard perspective. The Grizzlies, after 5 games, they will have the option to put Ja Morant on the suspension exempt list, which would create a 16th roster spot. That is huge for this team because if you go down the 15-man roster, sure, Joe Mullinax can complain about John Conchar all he wants, but the Grizzlies like their 15 guys. It would be hard for them to part ways with any of those guys. The way Memphis can approach this, and this is what I think will eventually happen in some way, is early in the season, after the 5 games, when they're able to, put Ja on the exempt list and get a 16th roster player, they may go in free agency and bring someone in. That player, whoever it is, will have a 20-game run with the Grizzlies, and Memphis can say, Xavier Tillman is a much better fit than this guy. Let's part ways. Or they can say, man, this guy's been so good. We got to let one of the young guys go at the bottom of the roster or whatever the case may be. And we got to roll with this guy. We got to sign him throughout the rest of the season. But they have the option of kind of using a trial run, sort of speak, early on in the season. That is kind of, I guess, the gift within the curse of Ja Morant's suspension. So
you're exactly right.
Some names, you think of free agency. For one, we're talking about free agency. These are guys that teams let go the whole summer without picking up.
Currently unemployed.
So don't come at me, hard with some of these names. But you're talking about guys like, Nerlens Noel, who's a noted rim protector, can rebound a little bit, but nothing too crazy. Dwayne Dedmon, known for his physicality, his toughness, really solid screen setter, really solid rebounder, but, doesn't play in heavy dosages, minutes-wise up at this point of his career. And Bismack Biyombo, who played a prominent role on the Suns last season, started a lot of games, when DeAndre Ayton, was out. He also played a big role off the bench, for that team, and has played a prominent role on some other teams in the past. Very bouncy, center, but he's another guy that's like 6'9", but very good shot blocker, a decent rebounder, all that good stuff. So you have some options from that perspective that you can go 20 games with. And then let's say those guys don't work out, because I know no one's, looking at those names and just salivating over them. So if none of those guys work out, and I didn't say the flashier free agent names on purpose, Joe, guys. We'll address that later. But I know people want to say, what about Dwight Howard? What about Boogie Cousins? We'll get to that another day, possibly. But as of for right now, the point I want to make is you have that situation solved after the 20 games, and you say, hey, this isn't going to work. Well, guess what? At that point, it'll be January, which will be close to the trade deadline, about a month before the trade deadline. You make it through January, guess what will happen? There will be more clarity in the playoff pictures for teams.
Absolutely.
You mentioned a team like the New York Knicks. Now I'm swinging on your side of things with the trade talk. I'm getting there, Joe. It took me a little time to get there, but now I'm getting to your side. I think the trade deadline is a perfect time to kind of evaluate what to do, because one, there will be more clarity in the playoff picture. We can say, oh, this player sounds good, this player sounds good. But in theory, right now, the only players that we can really kind of, I guess, project to the Grizzlies are players that we know that are for certain on bad teams. There are players right now who are on really good teams, and who, it's basketball, it's sports. Injuries happen, a little bloop and a little bop there, and one team that we're projecting to finish in the top 5 is in the bottom 5. And next thing you know,
right,
boom, some player that we had no clue was going to be available becomes available, and the Grizzlies can be right there to pounce on it. They have that $7.5 million trade exception that they can package with whatever they want to, potential pieces that they want to move in addition to that. And I think the names that you said are perfect start for a starting point. I like the Clint Capella, example. Okongwu is great over there, but Capella has 2 years left on his deal. I think, kind of similar to OG Anunoby, that might be a guy that they look at moving next season rather than this season, because the Hawks. But again, if the Hawks are bad and they look like they're going to be an 8th or 9th seed again, then they say, you know what? the Grizzlies are giving us this nice offer. We got a good backup center. Let's go ahead and take it. That's one that stands out to me as well. There are a couple other teams. You mentioned the Knicks. What if the Knicks are bad again? Like, what if the Knicks are not again? What if the Knicks are worse than last season? They kind of fall off a little bit, and it's like, man, Mitchell Robinson is a nice young piece, but he isn't developing on this thing. This Mitchell Robinson, Julius Randle core isn't working. The Grizzlies could be in position. I mean, he's making $15.8 million, I think, this season. $15.7 million. That would be a contract that's not too hard to get involved in. So I think the players that you mentioned are really solid examples. I think of the teams that have center depth, like you mentioned, the Blazers having DeAndre Ayton and Robert Williams. So Robert Williams would make sense. A team like the Clippers, the Grizzlies have traded with them before, right? They got Zubac and Plumlee. We all know that they love to play small. So if both of those guys stay healthy, why wouldn't the Clippers be opposed to say, hey, we'll trade, Plumlee, who's been a starter before and solid rebounder, very good athleticism, could come here. The Grizzlies
another underrated passer too.
Underrated passer, yeah. That's a sneaky skill for him. The thing is, everyone they'll address the depth part of this probably in the early going, and we'll see how that works out. And then later on, they'll be in position to make a big swing if the need and the potential is out there.
You're exactly right. And it's a lot more fun when we disagree, but I think you nailed exactly what's going to happen. And to be honest with you, it's the right thing to do. Again, I want to go get Wendell Carter Jr., but that's not
right now.
Logical progression, right? Everything. And the key is the Ja Morant suspension, as you alluded to. It is the silver lining in this dark cloud because they don't even have to do the disabled player thing right now. They can just wait till Ja goes on that suspended list. And then for 20 games, fill that spot with a big. It can be whoever they want it to be that is currently a free agent. And obviously teams are, waiving guys, making their rosters final. Maybe there's a surprise release that the teams, don't expect. And the Grizzlies can try to pick somebody up on waivers. There's so many options. Maybe they're calling teams and saying, hey, are you planning on keeping this guy? What's your plans for this guy? We'll give you a second-round pick just to give him to us instead of waiving him. There's all sorts of different ways this could work out. And I do think that that's the smartest way to approach this. Because, again, we know that they can win regular season games without Steven Adams. That's not the issue. The issue is the playoffs. They have time to get there. But what could accelerate this conversation is if the absence of Morant and Adams both leads to them starting slow. Like if they're 2-8 through their first 10 games, that might accelerate the timeline here, right? And I do think that's important. But if they're 5-5, 6-4, 4-6 even, I don't know that they hit a panic button. I think they do exactly what you just alluded to. Short-term depth, reevaluate when Ja returns heading into January. We've talked about that before. My usual line is call me at Christmas. Because of the Morant suspension, it's call me at Dr. King Day, basically. And when they get to that point, it's going to be right around the trade deadline. There's progression that they can go through. And that's a positive of the Morant situation, which is weird to say out loud. Obviously, we're going to be talking more about this Adams situation as the season unfolds. Of course, we're going to be talking more about season predictions. We probably need to get to that on our Tuesday episode of the show, partner, talking about, our overall thoughts. Yep, because we're 2 days away now, right, from opening night for the Memphis Grizzlies in particular. The NBA returns on Tuesday with a national slate, and then everybody's playing on Wednesday night, except for those teams that are playing the Tuesday game. Everybody's up on Wednesday, and Memphis is included in that as they take on the New Orleans Pelicans. So we'll talk a little bit more about Steven Adams. We'll take a look at overall projections where we have the Grizzlies landing in the Western Conference on our next episode. Thank you so much for joining us on this particular episode. Please like, comment, rate, review, subscribe wherever you get your podcasts, as well as over on YouTube. We are proud members of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team each and every day, free and available wherever you get your podcasts. For Damichael Cole,
You are Locked On Grizzlies.
By all means, make sure that you are doing exactly what you're supposed to be doing and not changing that dial. We are part of your Grizzlies experience each and every day that you allow us in here on Locked On Grizzlies. Catch you next time.